Okay, welcome. This is Chapter 32, Section 2, and we're going right along here with the events of World War II. And so we're going to look at some turning points, but it's mostly on the war in the Pacific. So we're going to look at a map in a second and kind of talk about what's happening here. So some things to remember. The war in China is not going well. Right? Japan is looking for resources, and the rival for resources in that area, of course, are the Europeans and the Americans. And I think something that we have to remember is that Japan also has imperial goals like Hitler. They too want to control the world. So they had a motto, Asia for the Asiatics, thinking that a lot of the Southeast Asians would rather have Japan, someone like them, as their imperial power rather than foreigners. But the people in Singapore and Thailand and the Philippines and Indonesia will soon realize they're just trading one foreign ruler for another who is almost just as cruel, if not crueler, is that a word? More cruel than the Europeans. So another thing I think we should think of when we think of the war in the Pacific, we can think of the brutal treatment of Allied POWs and the role of aircraft carriers. But why does Japan attack the United States? Because for them, as a Japanese general says, Pearl Harbor is a dagger pointed at Japan's throat and must be destroyed. So they knew they have to get these resources, they're going to bring in the Europeans and the Americans if they attack all of that territory. So over here is kind of their strategy here and how it looks ugly for the Allies at first. So they decide to carry out a series of surprise attacks. Americans, of course, mostly focus on December 7th, 1941 in the attack of Pearl Harbor, but at the same time, the Japanese also attack Hong Kong, Guam, Wake Island, and Thailand. They start to invade. So all over Asia on the same day, they attack these areas. Well, I guess technically it's the next day in Asia, the same time they attack Pearl Harbor, but you know what I'm saying. So by January of 1942, Japan attacks the Philippines. February, Japan reaches Singapore and Indonesia, which are controlled by the British and French respectively. And it's not until June of 42 that we start to see the turn of the tide in the U.S. favor with the Battle of Midway, but we'll talk more about that in a second. So let's take a look at a map here. Sorry it's not so clear, but it's the best one. So eventually you can see the gray areas. This is all the Japanese-controlled territory at the height of their power. And so you can see up here, right, Manchukuo, their puppet state Manchuria, so this is all of their Chinese territory, and this is what bogs them down. So by July of 1941, Japan has taken control of Indochina, which is, as you remember, I'm sure, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos today. So that is July 41, and then we can see here, wait for it, aha, December of 1941, they attacked Pearl Harbor, then Hong Kong, and then they began their invasion of Thailand. So that's now attacking both French, British, and American territory. So the United States is now in the war. But because the European countries are so bogged down in Europe, and because of Hitler's control, they're not able to send supplies and help to the Pacific. So this is a war fought between essentially the United States and the Australians, you know, Australia's right here, versus Japan. And so the parallel is the same. There's nothing to stop Japan initially, just like there was no one to stop Hitler for almost 2-3 years before they were able to turn the tide into the Allied favor. So the same thing happens in Japan. So then we see by January of 1942, soon after all of those territories fall to Japan, the United States takes another huge loss when the Philippines fall. And this is known, we'll take a picture here soon of General MacArthur, but he's one of the more notable figures here of the Pacific. And he has to evacuate the military base in Manila. There you see Manila right there. And he vows he shall return, and he eventually will. And then by March of 1942, right, all of Indonesia, which is of course Dutch territory at this point, is taken over by Japan. Okay, so let's look at some pictures. Oh, oops, sorry. And then of course there is the Battle of Midway, and that is the turning point in 1942 when the Allies then begin to advance on Japanese territory. So again, like Europe, Japan just kind of marches on through, and it's difficult for the Allies, in this case the Americans and Australians, to push Japan back. But that changes with Pearl Harbor. So here's some pictures of Pearl Harbor, so you can see the military base, right, which holds the bulk of our naval fleet. And here's some photographs here of the attack on Pearl Harbor. So that is a huge hit, right? 332 ships are destroyed. No, excuse me, that is not Pearl Harbor. Pretend I just said, where did I write down my stats? 19 U.S. ships are damaged. Some are sunk within 2 hours, right? Over 2,000 Americans are killed, 1,000 wounded. So we're surprised and shocked by this. But I just want to mention, your book talks a little bit about the Bataan Death March. The cruelty in the Pacific Theater cannot be underestimated. Both, not only our treatment of the Japanese, but in particular the treatment of captured Allied POWs. I won't go into detail because it's pretty awful, but feel free to watch HBO's Pacific with your parents' permission, and you can see that cruelty up close. Okay, so the Battle of Midway then is the turning point, but what I think is interesting about Pacific theater is this is Midway, this is it. And so you can see that it's just these tiny islands in the Pacific Ocean. And you can see here the importance of Midway for the Americans, of course, is that it's a place where our planes can land and take off, and an important place for supplies. So the Japanese are on their way to Midway, and the code breakers, unsung heroes here of World War II, know that the Japanese are on their way. So we're able to prepare for them and do through some trickery, right? It is then we are able to destroy 332 Japanese ships. So this is the turning point in the war. So you can see a lot of this fighting in the Pacific is done in the air, and then with the use of aircraft carriers, which are developed at this point, where the planes then can take off from ships rather than going to the islands. So imagine those first planes practicing that takeoff. Could be a little bit scary. Okay, and so the Philippines have fallen, and Douglas MacArthur, known because he's often with pipe in his mouth, there's also lots of famous pictures with these sunglasses, so he's an interesting dude. But he becomes the commander of the Allied forces in the Pacific, and he develops this strategy called island hopping. So they know it's too hard to attack Japan at this point, so they kind of jump around to these little islands, you know, ever trying to get closer and closer to Japan. And so these are small islands like I just showed you with the Battle of Midway. And little by little, we're able to gain an advantage in the Pacific. So you can see then some of the battles, famous battles here. And then the last two, which we'll talk about later, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, you can see how close we are to Japan. So by the time we get to these islands, it's all over but the dropping of atomic bombs. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. I kind of just zoomed through the main points here. And then maybe a little pitch to the NSA's museum here in Fort Meade, Maryland. I put the link there if you want to check it out. It's kind of cool if you're a nerd like me, and it maybe will help you like the NSA since they're taking a PR hit. But the NSA was developed at this point in history as code breakers. And so this is the Enigma machine, which the British come up with to help break the Germans' code in World War II. And then, of course, we break codes, the Japanese codes, which saved us at Midway. So it's a cool museum if you get a chance.